From the late 60s to the late 80s, there was a debate in South African literary circles around what South African writer and scholar Louis Nkosi termed the crisis of representation in black South African fiction. Nkosi, along with Nadine Gordimer, criticized the overtly political nature of what has come to be known as protest literature that black South African writers were producing. Nkosi wrote that these writers were producing journalistic fact parading outrageously as imaginative literature. He stressed that these writers were placing too much value on the political or ethical at the expense of the aesthetic development of their work. This debate was later taken up by Njabulo Ndebele in his influential collection of essays, Rediscovery of the Ordinary, Essays on South African Literature and Culture. Ndebele lambasted black South African writers of the 1970s and the early 80s for what he called their preoccupation with the representation of spectacle. He writes about what he perceived to be missing from South African protest literature: compelling and imaginative storytelling. Ndebele felt that South African writers were unable to resolve the conflict between the aim of storytelling and that of imparting social information. Other literary scholars and South African writers came out against this. Some pointed out that Nkosi, for example, was holding out South African fiction to Western literary standards, and that the work of Chinwezi and Mudibuike had shown us the danger of Western literary and critical theory in the analysis of African literature. Writers like Mbulela Mzamane, Miriam Tladi, Mongane Sirote, and Kiorapetse Khositsile continuously made the argument that their writing was so political because it was part of what was happening and that it was reflecting the times in which it was being produced. It is a fascinating exercise to go into the archive from this time and to read both sides of this argument. This debate can be used to help explain the current state of South African literature, not only in terms of its aesthetics and form, but also in terms of its commercial viability. However, what I want to focus on is a concept that came out of Ndebele's critique that I noted when I recently read Keletso Mopai's collection of short stories, If You Keep Digging. I will attempt to use Ndebele's idea of the ordinary to try and understand why Mopayi's stories about ordinary people going through the motions of their daily lives spoke to me in such a clear and powerful way. In Rediscovery of the Ordinary, Essays on South African Literature and Culture, Njabulo Ndebele characterizes spectacular literature as literature that documents. It indicts implicitly. It is demonstrative, preferring exteriority to interiority. It keeps the larger issues of society in our minds, obliterating the details. It provokes identification through recognition and feeling, rather than through observation and analytical thought. It calls for emotion rather than conviction. It establishes a vast sense of presence without offering intimate knowledge. It confirms without necessarily offering a challenge. It is the literature of the powerless identifying the key factor of their powerlessness. I think that this definition of spectacle is closely related to the superficiality that we have come to associate with melodrama. Peter Brooks described numerous features that are characteristic of melodrama in his book, The Melodramatic Imagination. One of these features is a dramatic choice between heightened moral alternatives where the main characters are represented as either good or evil. All the other characters are shown as being on either side and there is no moral ambiguity. Another feature that Brooks discusses is characters being reduced to a few summary traits and at times being reduced to physical characteristics that signal them as either a villain, a hero, a damsel, a wise mentor, or other such stereotypes. Ndebele's definition of spectacle and Brooks's discussion on melodrama made me think of the historical plays of Herbert Isaac Dlomo, the novels of Sue Nyathi, and the television series produced by Shonda Rhimes. Dlomo was interested in allegorizing the struggles of black South Africans in the early 20th century by exploring the powers of African nations in the 19th century. In the play Cetshwayo, for example, one of the things Dlomo was preoccupied with was the juxtapositioning of the cruelty of the British colonizers and the Boer farmers with the righteousness of the Zulu people. As such, both sides are either portrayed as heroes or villains. There is no middle ground, no grey area. In her second novel, The Gold Diggers, Sunyati focuses more on keeping the broader issues and experiences of Zimbabwean immigrants in South Africa at the forefront of the reader's imagination, rather than immersing the reader in the full details of the moments of devastation or jubilation that the characters find themselves in. And in Scandal, Shonda Rhimes' characters always have these long, fast-paced monologues whose function is to lay all the emotions of the characters on the table. These monologues lack the subtlety and subtext of everyday conversations that involve powerful people and their entities. This is not to say that there's anything wrong with the representation of spectacle as they appear in Shonda Rhimes' shows. These shows do important representational work. We need to see powerful and complicated black women like Annalise Keating and Olivia Pope living their best lives, succeeding, failing, choosing themselves over everyone else, falling in love, having their hearts broken, breaking hearts themselves, and exercising agency over their bodies and their lives. Of course, this is not to say that these storytellers are exclusively interested in spectacle. The stories they tell are important critiques of the societies around them, their characters have complicated interiority, and their stories are a mixture of emotion and conviction. The point I'm trying to make is that their work leans more towards spectacle than what Ndebele calls the ordinary. In contrast to spectacle, Ndebele tells us that the ordinary is sobering rationality. It is the forcing of attention on necessary detail. It is analytical storytelling designed to deliberately break down the barriers of the obvious in order to reveal new possibilities of understanding and action. Paying attention to the ordinary and its methods will result in significant growth of consciousness. For me, this brought to mind the novels of Bessie Head, like Maru and When Rain Clouds Gather, Issa Rae's television series Insecure, and most recently the short story collection If You Keep Digging by Keletso Mopai. In Maru, Head turns the idea of race and racialized oppression on their heads by engaging the reader in village life in rural Botswana where one group of people is enslaved by another. And on Insecure, Ray uses the lives of two ordinary black women living in the United States to tap into some of the universal aspects of the experiences of so many young black people across the world. This idea of ordinariness also came through for me when I read If You Keep Digging. On the back cover of the book, Oki Ndibe praised Mopai for her sharpness of observation, social awareness, lucidity of language, wit, and narrative control. I want to focus on three of these aspects that Ndibe points out: Mopai's observations, her social awareness, and her use of language. The opening story of the collection is titled Madness. Told from the perspective of a young woman called Dikeledi, the story is set on the day of the funeral of Dikeledi's older brother Lucky. Dikeledi leads the reader through the funeral service at home while giving us flashbacks of the events leading up to her brother's death. Mopai uses this story to problematize the ways in which black South Africans deal with issues of mental health in our communities. Very early on in the story, Mopai talks about how people who suffer from mental illness are treated in many black communities in South Africa, particularly those whose mental illness has severe symptoms. There is a balance of compassion and ridicule. Mopai shows this to us by having Dikeledi tell the reader about how, as a result of her brother's madness, he becomes famous. Everyone in the township knew him, she says. I have personally seen this fame across many townships where everyone not only knows the individual suffering from mental illness, but there is a considerate compassion with which they are treated. If they are hungry and they walk into someone's house, they will be fed. Or, if they roam too far from home and someone who knows them sees them, arrangements will be made to return them to their family. However, the other side of this is that there are those who are not so kind and compassionate. Some will not only make fun of them, but they will throw their insults in the direction of the family members of those suffering from mental illness. In Mopai's story, this is directed at Lucky's wife, Maide. Dikeledi tells us that after her brother's mental illness started to take hold, her sister-in-law would cry herself to sleep all the time because of how people would insult and laugh at her and her husband. In addition to this, Mopai highlights the important element of shame that comes from family members. Lucky's mother and uncle speak so highly of him at his funeral, like they were not ashamed of him when he was still alive. How dare they? How dare they make it seem like they weren't ashamed of my brother's madness? Dikeledi tells the reader towards the end of the story. There is also the interesting stereotype of the mad genius that Mopai engages. I can't remember how many times people in the townships where I grew up used to say to me when I was younger that I must not concentrate on my schoolwork too much, otherwise I would go insane. This is something that Dikeledi alludes to in the telling of her story. Lucky did so well in his final year of high school that his face was plastered on newspapers and television. Another thought-provoking idea that Ndebele discusses in Rediscovery of the Ordinary is that African folk culture exists in its own independent silo. It does not need or want legitimization from the Western culture that has developed around it and dominated it. If something does not make sense or goes wrong in the lives of many black people across the continent, it is not a far-fetched idea to think that there are agents of evil that have brought this ill will upon them. Ndebele writes, African folk culture has an independent life of its own, right bang in the middle of civilization, of Western rationality. The surrounding superior civilization is rendered of no consequence whatsoever. It is as good as not there. The experience is accorded a validity that does not have to justify itself at all. Because of this, Lucky's mother blames Lucky's mental state on witches throughout the story. For Dikeledi, there is a duality that seems to coexist without any contradiction. Lucky's mental state can be interpreted as a mental illness that needs medication and as the result of a curse from a witch. Dikeledi tells the reader, Mama concluded that someone in this township had bewitched Lucky, that this particular wicked witch who'd stolen his mind away had died and taken my brother's brain to the grave. This is language that is still widely used in many black communities. If something bad happens to you and you cannot shake it off in any way, no matter what you do, it must be that the person who has cursed you has already died and the curse cannot be undone. Mopayi's use of language is also very reminiscent of what I have heard and interacted with throughout townships in South Africa. Another example appears at the beginning of the story. Mama came into my bedroom when Lucky's body arrived home from the mortuary. Come see your brother for the last time. He's here, she said, like he wasn't really dead, like he was just lying in his coffin sleeping. This way of speaking about and to someone's corpse as if they are still alive is a common practice. The other stories in If You Keep Digging make insightful commentary as well. They ask interesting questions about post-1994 South Africa by also engaging what Ndebele calls the ordinary. In Monkeys and In Papa's Name, Mopai asks us to reconsider the neoliberal idea that what is going to change the world for the better is more opportunities and representation for marginalized groups. The juxtaposition of wealth and poverty in these two stories is jarring in an unspectacular way when one makes the connection between them. In Leti, Mopai replaces the spectacle that we usually find in stories about men and the women they cheat on. She deliberately shifts the focus from the catfighting between the women being cheated on, which we have come to expect in these narratives, and focuses instead on the kinds of relationships that can develop between these women. With 14, Mopai gives us a ghost story that forces us to grapple with South Africa's exploitative mining industry by humanizing the people who go underground to mine gold in a unique way. And in Becoming a God, Mopai continues her exploration of African folk culture and spirituality that she started in Madness and 14. She writes about African spirituality and folklore in an experiential way. It needs no justification, no contextualization, and makes no apologies to the logic and reason we are taught to depend on in modern society. By engaging with the day-to-day lives of ordinary people living in South Africa, Keletso Mopai has given us a collection of short stories that do not merely reflect and document the situation of black people in post-1994 South Africa. She has given us a text that shows a deep understanding of the historical, social, political, and economic standing of South Africa precisely because she chose to focus on the ordinary. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching. I want to give a shout out to Yolisa Kenqu. Her master's thesis is an absolute gem and was very instructive for me when I was doing background reading for this video. I also want to mention an exciting streaming site that has been started by a young filmmaker who goes by the name of Mbali Mashaba. The platform is called Behind Her Lens Visuals and it aims to centralize different forms of digital storytelling, web series, documentaries, films, music videos, and other forms of audio-visual storytelling. The site also features reviews and articles, and they'll be publishing some of my own work. You can check them out via the link in the description. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.